Dan, welcome. Okay, I'm going to share the screen. We're going to get started.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Hello, how's it going?
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
Good.
Where's my screen?
Well, we can see you.
There we go. Okay, can we see that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, lovely. So we get started. It's chapter 4. So we're learning obviously about making acquisitions. So what we're going to learn today is interesting. It's connected to the possibility of your property acquiring on your behalf. That we learned a chatzer, a courtyard. Here we're talking about somebody's a utensil that belongs to you, and when and how, if something is placed in it, that you make an acquisition through your utensil. Okay, that's the particular focus of chapter 4. So let's begin. Containers owned by a person can acquire articles on his behalf wherever he has permission to place them down. We're going to clarify what that means. In other words, if the vessel is in a place that you have particular permission to have your vessel there, then the vessel can acquire on your behalf, just like your courtyard can acquire on your behalf. And so therefore, once movable property enters this container, neither can retract, not the buyer nor the seller. It is if the article were lifted up or placed in his home, as we've learned. Therefore, a person's containers cannot acquire articles on his behalf in a public domain or in a domain belonging to the seller, unless the seller tells him, go acquire the article with this container. So if I own a bucket and it's in an area that I'm allowed to have it there, not a public domain or not in the seller's domain, and he puts it in, it acquires on my behalf. Similarly, if the purchaser first acquired the container, so it's from the same seller, so I'm buying a bucket from you, and I lifted it up, but now it's still in your domain, right? And afterwards, I place it down, and then brought produce from our board, so fruit, and he puts the fruit in that container. Then I have acquired the fruit. You know, even though that container is sitting in the seller's property. Why? Why do we say that's okay in that instance? Because since the seller derives satisfaction from selling the container, he does not object to the container being placed in his domain. In other words, although he doesn't explicitly say, use that to acquire your fruit, we accept that he's acknowledged that will be the form of how the buyer, will acquire it. Halacha 2, just as containers belonging to the purchaser do not acquire articles from him when placed in the seller's domain, so too, containers belonging to the seller. So I'm buying fruit from you, and your container is in my property, and the fruit is now put into that container. Even though it's your container is in my property, and usually my property acquires on my behalf, because it's in your container on my property, it also is not considered purchased until I have it, because it's not directly on my property, it's in your container. Mechira, right? That's handing over an object. May be used to acquire an article only in the public domain. And the reason is because in a public domain, there's no other real way that you can do it. You can't rely on your property. Or in a courtyard that is not owned by either the seller or the purchaser. Otherwise, it's preferable that your property actually acquires it on your behalf. So we only rely on handing it over if it's a public domain or a place that neither of you own, because you can't rely on the property to acquire on your behalf. Then you can hand it over. Mechira, if you're drawing something, right, that's another way that you can acquire something. So you do that generally, I guess, with some live animals, or if it's large and too heavy. May be used to acquire an article only in a corner of a public domain or in a courtyard that is owned jointly by the seller and the purchaser. But this concept of a simta, it's a corner or a separate space where people would step out of the public domain to engage in acquisition. So you could use Mechira in those areas. Hagba'ah, lifting something up, that's the greatest form of making an acquisition, and may be used to acquire articles in any place. So even if you selling to me and I'm in your property, but I lift it, after the greed, as we'll see on the price, then I can acquire it. Lifting is the greatest form of acquisition. Halacha 4. The following rule applies when an article that could be acquired through Mechira is located in the public domain, right? So what happens So now you're drawing it, the buyer buying it is drawing it towards his domain or into a simta, into an area in the public domain that's sectioned off for this type of acquisition where people do business. As soon as he removes a portion of the article from the public domain, he acquires it. Notice you don't have to move the whole thing into that area. As soon as part of it is moved out of the public domain, you acquire the entirety of it. Halacha 5. When there is a load of produce in the public domain, so you got a whole bunch of fruit, and it's in the Reshut HaRabim, in the public domain. After having established a price, so you got a pile of fruit, and I come to you and I say, okay, I want that for 50 Rand. You say, fine, agreed upon, 50 Rand. Now I start to take that pile, that bundle of fruit, and into my domain or into that area in the public domain that is sectioned off. I acquire it, even though I haven't measured how much fruit is actually there. Okay? Because once the price is agreed on, I know that the seller is willing to sell whatever it is, even though I don't know the exact amount or weight for that price. So now that I've drawn it into my possession, the deal is done. Similarly, if while in the public domain the purchaser measures produce that he purchases, he acquires it, item by item, for as he measures it, he's lifting it up. So we agree on a price and are taking one at a time to measure it. So acquiring it, each one as I lift it, because I'm lifting it. If by contrast, the seller measures the produce into the containers belonging to the purchaser, okay, the purchaser does not acquire it, for a purchaser's containers cannot acquire on his behalf in the public domain, as we mentioned. So if you're in public, you've got a bunch of fruit, and I got a bucket there, and you're putting it into my bucket, that I don't automatically acquire it in the public domain. If the produce is located in a domain belonging to the purchaser, once the seller agrees to sell the produce, the purchaser acquires it, even if he does not measure it. Again, because my property is acquiring on my behalf. If the produce is located in a domain belonging to the seller, or in a domain belonging to a person to whom the seller has entrusted it, so it's a third party, the purchaser, I'm buying it, does not acquire the produce until he lifts it up. Because it's not in a property that acquires on my behalf, I have to actually make an acquisition. Or until he removes it from the seller's domain by renting its space or the like, as will be explained. So the alternative is, if it's too much for me to lift and it's sitting in your property or third person property, I can say to you, okay, let me rent the space that produce is upon, and then that now acts on my behalf, just as a space that I own would act on my behalf to acquire for me. Following rules applies when the produce is located in a corner of the public domain, or in a domain belonging to both the seller and the purchaser, or even if it is in a domain belonging to the purchaser, but in containers belonging to the seller, and the seller agrees to sell the produce and has begun to measure it into the containers belonging to the seller. So if the seller tells the producer, okay, so right, I'm either standing in a place in a public domain or an area that belongs to both of us, or it's in the purchaser's, in the seller's domain, right? But it's in the domain of the purchaser, but a bucket that belongs to the seller. And now he's starting, and it's the person that's selling it that is transferring it, right? Because if the buyer is actually lifting it, if the purchaser is lifting it, then he acquires it as soon as he's lifted. So here we're talking about where the person selling the produce is doing the transfer into this area, okay? So now this is how it works. If the seller tells the purchaser, I will sell you a kor of produce for 30 seller. Now a kor is a certain amount that was equal to 30 sa'ah, but he said, I'm going to sell you one kor for 30 seller. So, and now he starts to transfer it, right? He can retract even at the last sa'ah. And in other words, until he's transferred the entire amount, he can always retract because the produce is in his containers and he has not completed the measurement, right? So the agreement was for the entire amount. And because when he's transferring and he's putting it into a container that belongs to himself, the agreement only comes into full effect once the entire amount has been placed into that container. For the containers belong to the seller and do not acquire for the purchaser, even in the purchaser's domain. Now, but if he told him, if he said as follows, right? If he said, I will sell you a kor of produce for 30 seller, and he then explains one seller per sa'ah, because remember I said a kor is made up of 30 sa'ah, then even if the seller is the one putting the produce into his bucket, utensil belongs to him, the purchaser acquires each sa'ah that is handed over. Why? Because the agreement was per measurement of that total, not just one price agreed on for the total. For since the seller mentioned the price for each individual sa'ah, each of those units is a distinct entity. Whenever the seller lifts up a sa'ah and puts it into the measure, the sale of the unit is concluded. That's in both cases. If the seller lifts it, retract. As soon as he puts over one sa'ah, because he's broken down the sale into a measurement of a seller for a sa'ah, each one is transferred at that moment. The rationale for this law is that the produce is not located in the domain belonging to the seller, nor is it in the public domain. If the produce was held in the containers of the seller, the purchaser would acquire it once the price was agreed upon, since it is located in his domain, even though it is not being measured, as has been explained in the previous halakha. Right, so if we're talking about something that was in the buyer's domain, it would automatically be acquired by him. But here we're talking about where he's putting it into a vessel that belongs to himself, and then he would only acquire it according to the agreement. So if the agreement was a total amount for the total measurement, the sale only takes place once the total measurement has been transferred. But if the agreement clarified that it's an amount per measure of the total amount, then the buyer would be acquiring it one sa'ah at a time as it's transferred. Halacha 8. Similar rules apply when a person sells wine or oil to a colleague in a corner of the public domain, or in a courtyard belonging to both the seller and the purchaser, or in a domain belonging to the purchaser, and the measure belongs to the broker. So there's a third party. So in other words, in any of those domains that we spoke about, if there's a broker in between, and the broker is using his own instrument to measure what's being transferred. So let's say I'm buying a liter of wine from you, and there's a middleman, and he's going to pour wine from your bucket into this bottle, let's say, which is then going to come to me. Before the measure is filled, the liquid remains the seller's, so the broker stands in the middle, and until the total amount has been gone into the broker's utensil, he's acting on behalf of the seller. Once the total amount is in the utensil, it's now like he's acting on behalf of the buyer. And so once the measure is filled, the liquid becomes the purchaser's, and neither of them can retract. Similar rules apply if produce is held in a corner of the public domain or in a courtyard belonging to both the seller and the purchaser. The measuring container does not belong to either of them, and the seller was measuring. Before the measure is filled, it remains in the possession of the seller. Once the measure is filled over, it becomes the purchaser's. Right, so we're talking about all these type of scenarios where there's no absolute space that's going to acquire it on behalf of the buyer, nor is it going to be transferred from the seller. The only thing that we do have is the agreed upon total amounts. How much I'm paying for you, and how much you're giving me. So only once the total has been transferred is the acquisition complete. But up until that point, you can back out. Halacha 10. The following rule applies when the measure belongs to either the purchaser or the seller, and it has marks indicating a halfway point. So let's say I'm buying a liter of wine, and I'm measuring it in a cup, and that cup has a liter, but it's got at 250 mils, it's got a mark that says 1 cup. At 500 mils, it says 500 mils, and at the top it says 1 liter. So he says in that instance, if there's a mark on it, and it doesn't matter if it belongs to the buyer or to the seller, once the product, like so let's say it's wine, reaches one of those markings, that portion is acquired, even though the entire measure has not yet been full. So last time I'm going to pay 100 Rand for a liter, and you've only poured 500 mil, but because that 500 mil is marked out, for every marking is considered to be a measure in its own right, and therefore the acquisition takes place. But the measure belongs to one of them, and he relies on its markings. Halacha 11. Maintain awareness of this significant general principle. So here's a general rule. When a person acquires movable property, he acquires it if he establishes the price and afterwards lifts up the article. Okay? So you got fruit. I say I'm going to pay 100 Rand for that bundle of fruit. Once I establish the price and I lift it, or I pull it, whatever, I've acquired it. If he first lifts, if I pick up this stuff and I say, okay, I want to buy this from you, and then I put it down, and then you say, okay, it's 100 Rand, I haven't acquired it just because I picked it up before we agreed on the price. Because I lifted it up before we agreed on the price. Instead, it's only when he lifts it up after the price is established or performs Mechira on an object that is not ordinarily lifted up, In other words, once I'm doing active acquisition, that active acquisition has to be after the price was agreed on, not before. I can't say, well, I picked it up and now put it down and now we agree on the price, it's fine. I would have to actually make another acquisition. Halach of 12, when an object that has a standard and known price is sold. So now we've just said that you have to establish a price before you pick it up to acquire it, right? But there's going to be an exception. If there's an object that has a known price and the purchaser lifts it up, he acquires it. If there's a standard price for something, let's say, I don't know, it's the first thing that comes to mind is where there's a standard price of petrol. Let's say you pick up a liter of petrol. Everybody knows what the price is. We don't want to know what the price is, but we know what the price is, right? And so because it's a known price, there's no like negotiation. It's not uncertain. You would acquire it, even though he and the seller agree on the price only after he lifts it up. Because even when he lifted it, both of them know what the value is. Similarly, with regard to other means through which movable property is acquired. In other words, it doesn't feel lifting up, whatever method you're going to make the acquisition, if it's something that you know the price on, it's as if the price was agreed on. The acquisition must be made after the price of the article is established, unless there is a standard price for the article, as has been explained. That's summarizing the point. Halacha 13. For this reason, the following rules apply if a person draws donkey drivers and the produce their beasts are carrying, and porters bearing containers filled with produce into his home. So you got a guy who drives a donkey, and on his donkey there's produce, and he brings it into his own property. Or there's a porter carrying stuff, and he brings it into his property. So if the produce is measured before a price is established, even if the produce is the one, even if the purchaser is the one who measures, or they establish the price and then the seller measures the produce, both the seller and the purchaser are entitled to retract, because it came to his property before he made they agreed on the price. Different rules apply if the purchaser unloaded the produce and brought it into his home, because then he's made an acquisition. If a price was established and then the seller measured, neither can retract, because as he's measuring it, he's lifting it to make the acquisition, and the price has already been agreed on. For the seller had made the commitment to sell once the price is agreed on. Now, if he measured before a price was established, then both can retract, because even though he's lifted it but they didn't establish the price, there's no acquisition, because he has not made a commitment to sell. Until he says the price, there's no commitment to sell. This applies even if the purchaser measures. In other words, he's actually making an acquisition. It doesn't matter, because there was no price agreed on before, and he doesn't have the seller's intent. Halacha 14. The following rules apply if a person takes utensils from a craftsman in order to inspect them to see whether he'll purchase them. Right? Sometimes you walk into a shop and it says, "What does it say? You can, if you break it, you pay for it." So what happens if you go to a craftsman? He's got a beautiful thing. You pick it up. You haven't agreed on any prices yet. You have an intention that you want to buy it because you're looking at it because it's something that you're interested in. And now, if they had a fixed price and they are destroyed by force beyond his control while in his possession, he is responsible for their value. If there's a fixed, in other words, you saw the price on let's say it was on the shelf, you saw the price, it says 500 rand, and you're picking it up because you have an interest in it, and then it breaks. So because you knew what the price was, and because you lifted it to inspect it, even though you hadn't made the full agreement, but your intention was that you were hoping to acquire it, at that point it's as if you acquired it. So you break it, you got to pay for it. The rationale is that since they are of a fixed value, they are considered to have entered his domain at the time that he lifted it up. But he says this is on two conditions. One, he lifted the utensil up with the intent of acquiring it in its entirety. In other words, he was a serious buyer. And B, the article being sold would be appreciated by the purchaser. So there were, in other words, those intentions basically frame it that when he picked it up, he's made an acquisition. And so now that it breaks, he has to compensate the seller. He has to pay for it. Whenever the seller is repelled by an article and seeks and indeed pursues an opportunity to sell it, it remains in the domain of the seller until a price has been established and the purchaser lifts it up afterwards. In other words, if it's not something that he actually wanted, but some guy's got a garage sale or something, he's trying to push stuff out of his house, and I happen to walk past, I haven't agreed on a price, I look at something, I don't have a real particular interest, I'm looking at it because the guy's trying to sell it, and then it breaks, we can't say that I, having picked it up and made an acquisition, an intentional acquisition, and because there's no price known about it, we can't say that there was an agreement with the seller either, and I wouldn't have that responsibility. Halacha 15. All the above rules apply when the purchaser himself performs Mechira on an object, lifts it up, or manifests ownership over it, if he's machazik, or tells another person to lift it up, performs Mechira or manifests ownership over it. Now, the point is whether he does it himself or he asks someone to do it on his behalf. The other person acquires for the purchaser. This is the idea of shlichut, the concept of giving somebody to be your representative, your proxy. So because this is something that he's doing on my behalf, all these acquisitions take place. This also applies with regard to other acts of acquisition. Whatever the act of acquisition would be, if I ask someone to do it on my behalf, it is effective. Okay, so let's go to the questions. Which of the following kinyanim work in any type of domain, both public and private? Hagba'a, Meshicha, or Mesira? Hagba'a is lifting up, Meshicha is drawing, Mesira is handing over. Which one works anyway?
Number 2.
Okay, Hagba'a, lifting up. Lifting is the one that works everywhere. Okay. It's question 2. Does a purchaser's container, so the buyer's container, acquire articles that are placed inside it when it is in the domain of the seller? That's correct. It's no. Okay. And number 3, can a person acquire something by having someone else manifest ownership over it on his behalf? That was the last halakha, right? Any form of acquisition, right? Any form of acquisition, you can ask someone to do it on your behalf and it would be acquired. And a final question, when a person sells wine using a measuring cup belonging to a broker, at what point does the wine become the purchaser's? So there's a middleman. As soon as the wine is poured into the measuring cup, once the measuring cup is filled, or once the wine is poured from the measuring cup into the container of the purchaser, at which point does it become the purchaser's?
I think number 3.
Okay, let's clarify. Number 2, right? Remember we said if there's a middleman, until it's full, it belongs to, he's kind of working on behalf of the seller. Once it's full, he's now represents the buyer and the purchaser. Yeah. And then it becomes his, even though he hasn't actually transferred it over to the purchaser's utensil. He's acquired on his behalf.
Yeah.
Okay, Shukach.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks, Rabbi. Thank you.
And David, Jeff, we'll see you next week, Bezrat Hashem.